When Nazi Germany finally collapsed in May of 1945, the war did not end instantly beneath the waves. Scattered across the North Atlantic, the Norwegian fjords, and the waters surrounding occupied Europe, more than 100 German submarines were still patrolling, as if the war remained unwon. For years, they had prowled the shipping lanes undetected, launching sudden and devastating attacks that starved Britain of supplies and threatened entire Allied convoys. But now, with Germany defeated and the Third Reich in ruins, these steel predators suddenly found themselves without a cause. Their next mission was not combat, it was surrender. On the day the armistice was declared, Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had briefly succeeded Hitler and had once commanded the submarine arm, transmitted a terse and final order to every U-boat still at sea. They were instructed to surface immediately, shut down offensive operations, raise black surrender flags, and turn themselves over to the closest Allied forces. Across the ocean, crews weary from years of underwater combat maneuvered their vessels to the surface, not to strike, but to yield. Allied aircraft shadowed them from above, watching as the dreaded hunters of the Atlantic crossed slowly toward ports, no longer as enemies but as captives. Over the following weeks, German submarines arrived at ports in Scotland, Northern Ireland, England, and beyond. Places like Loch Erebol and Lisa Halley, once quiet naval anchorages, suddenly filled with long lines of surrendered vessels, their gray hulls streaked with rust and battle damage. Some had barely limped home. Leaking fuel tanks, dead batteries, and shattered systems made their final journeys dangerous. Others never reached port at all, sinking due to structural damage or scuttling attempts before they could be seized. Boarding teams from the Royal Navy and the United States Navy swarmed the captured submarines as soon as they arrived, confiscating code books, navigational charts, and weapons. Engineers inspected them carefully, noting innovations that had made German submarines such formidable threats early in the war. Many of the crews spent months in captivity, uncertain what awaited them. Some were interrogated because they possessed valuable technical knowledge, engineers familiar with advanced propulsion systems or commanders who had experience in stealth tactics. Others simply waited for repatriation, eventually returning to a shattered homeland divided among occupying powers. By the end of 1945, Allied harbors were overcrowded with captured submarines. What had once been the core of Germany's most feared naval program had become a logistical burden. The Allies now faced a difficult and strategic question. What should become of this vast submarine fleet? Some nations saw technological opportunity, especially in newer models that hinted at the future of naval warfare. Others saw potential geopolitical risk. Allowing such vessels to remain intact could shift power balances in the coming post-war order. Between these competing priorities, most submarines were eventually slated for disposal. That decision led to one of the least known but most sweeping naval operations of the post-war era. The systematic destruction of the captured U-boat fleet, carried out under a plan known as Operation Deadlight. Over the winter of 1945 and early 1946, the Royal Navy towed more than 100 captured submarines into the open Atlantic, far from shipping routes for deliberate sinking. The mission was carried out in bleak winter seas northwest of Ireland, an unforgiving stretch of ocean chosen to ensure that none of the wrecks would pose hazards to navigation. Many submarines never even made it to the designated sinking zones. Their hulls, worn down by years of war and months of neglect, buckled against rough winter weather. More than a third sank while being towed, pulled under by waves, or failing structurally mid-journey. Those that survived the trip met a variety of ends. Some were opened and allowed to flood naturally. Others were destroyed by gunfire from escort ships, while a few were used as live fire targets for rockets and naval artillery. The operation erased nearly the entire fleet from the ocean's surface. Among those destroyed were submarines that had played defining roles in the closing months of the war. One boat had fired the final torpedoes against Allied shipping just days before Germany's surrender, only to be sunk months later as part of the cleanup efforts. Another, formerly one of the Kriegsmarine's advanced long-range vessels, was sunk after scientists had thoroughly studied its engineering. Yet, even as Operation Deadlight sent most submarines to the seabed, not all vessels met that fate. A select group, particularly the Type Flintehant and Type White III submarines, were spared. These represented cutting-edge German engineering, far more advanced than earlier U-boat classes, capable of traveling submerged for longer periods with streamlined hulls designed for underwater rather than surface combat. They were prototypes for what submarines would one day become. The Allies recognized this immediately and divided the remaining advanced boats among major powers for study. To formalize the redistribution, the Allies set up the Tripartite Naval Commission. The United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union each received a portion of the surviving fleet. Engineers dismantled these submarines piece by piece, measuring and documenting everything from periscope optics to bolt patterns. In American shipyards, naval architects ran performance trials that later influenced submarine classes developed for the early Cold War. In the Soviet Union, several of the high-tech German models served as direct inspirations for new submarine classes, helping the USSR accelerate its naval modernization. This strategic use of German engineering soon fed into an escalating technological rivalry beneath the polar seas. Other nations benefited as well. France, rebuilding a navy weakened by occupation, incorporated several former German boats into active service. Norway adopted some for coastal defense and maritime patrol missions. Canada used at least one as a training vessel to help its navy practice anti-submarine tactics. A handful were dismantled only after extensive testing, while others served quietly through the late 1940s before being retired. By the end of the decade, most had been scrapped or deliberately sunk once their knowledge value had been exhausted. But the influence of these vessels outlived their steel hulls. Their revolutionary battery capacity, submerged maneuverability, and hull design became foundational elements of global submarine development throughout the 1950s and into the nuclear age. They were, in many ways, Germany's final and unintended gift to future naval warfare. Only a handful of submarines escaped destruction entirely and transitioned into a final existence as museum pieces or memorial relics. Today, these survivors are scattered across Europe and North America. One of the best preserved examples sits in northern Germany, where visitors can step inside cramped sleeping quarters, peer into torpedo tubes, and feel the oppressive, narrow corridors that once housed crews for weeks at sea. Another sits in France, preserved in a port once used by Germany during the height of the Battle of the Atlantic. Across the ocean in Chicago, a captured submarine stands on display in a museum, representing not only a symbol of wartime technology, but also the first enemy vessel publicly exhibited on American soil. It serves as both educational exhibit and a reminder of the conflict that dominated the global seas. Meanwhile, most of the submarines destroyed in Operation Deadlight still rest intact on the seabed, forming one of the largest submarine cemeteries in the world. They lie mostly undisturbed in cold, deep waters, their hulls preserved by low oxygen and frigid temperatures. Only in recent decades have deep-sea expeditions documented their condition, capturing images of intact conning towers and rusting pressure hulls frozen in time like sunken monuments. Public interest in these vessels continues to grow. Museums dedicated to naval history attract thousands of visitors each year, and historians still uncover stories of the men who operated these machines. For many, the surviving submarines and the wrecks beneath the Atlantic serve as memorials not to machinery, but to the tens of thousands of sailors, German and Allied, who fought and died in underwater warfare. The U-boats once symbolized fear, technological innovation, and strategic dominance. Now they stand as reminders of sacrifice, ambition, and the heavy human price paid beneath the world's oceans. In the end, the German submarine fleet met a quiet fate. The wolves of the Atlantic, once feared across every convoy route, now rest in silence. Some on display for future generations, others buried beneath the waves. Their story did not end with surrender. It concluded slowly, through study, destruction, and remembrance. Today, whether preserved in museums or lying untouched in the cold darkness of the ocean floor, they remain ghostly remnants of a war that reshaped the world and the oceans alike.